This is episode 89 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing. I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week, we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. I am very pleased to be joined this week by Elisa Martinez. She is the executive director of the New Mexico Alliance for Life and an old friend of both myself and the show, Tipping Point, New Mexico, going back to our days on the radio. And we're happy to have you on the show here, Elisa, because unlike almost every conservative cause in the state of New Mexico that got their rear ends handed to them, so to speak, in this progressive-filled legislative session, the New Mexico Alliance for Life really was able to stand firm. So let's talk about yourself first, your involvement in this issue, but also your past involvement in other efforts like the Americans for Prosperity.
Well, thanks for having me on the show, Paul, and the Rio Grande Foundation. I appreciate it. We're coming off of a pretty successful legislative session where I think a lot of other issues and groups saw pretty major defeat, and now we're seeing a lot of these bills that were enacted into law, unfortunately. But in our advocacy area of the pro-life issue, we did have a really big surprising victory. We're able to get 8 Democrats to vote against a bill that would have codified abortion up to birth, as well as infanticide here in New Mexico.
Now, you're a pro-life organization, which is a little unusual for this podcast, and our efforts are focused on New Mexico's economy. And as people who listen to the show know, that we didn't have a great session from an economic perspective this time around. But you're not just limited to, as an organization, New Mexico Alliance for Life also works on the assisted suicide issue as well. Are those the two big areas that you worked on this session, or is that kind of broadly encompassing start of life, end of life issues? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, we also had to face a really radical assisted suicide piece of legislation that was introduced that we also advocated against. And regardless,
what was the bill number on that?
It was called HB 90, and I believe SB 143, and this was called Elizabeth Whitfield Right to Die Act. And so this, basically what that entailed was they wanted to empower physicians and hospitals and even non-physicians to be able to prescribe lethal drugs in a fatal diagnosis within a 6-month time frame. So let's say if you went to your doctor today, they said, you know what, Paul, you're going to die in 6 months. You have, some aggressive form of cancer. Then at that point, you would be a candidate for these lethal suicide drugs. But the caveat to all of this, regardless of where people stand on the issue, that the insurance companies come into play. And the concern for New Mexicans is that if this bill were to have passed, then you're looking at, well, what if I want to live? Well, a lot of the insurance companies are no longer going to fund your right to treatment because it's so expensive versus lethal drugs. And we've seen this in California and Oregon has taken place there. And so, it's really dangerous, I think, and really, again, it opens rights for some people, but it's going to limit rights for a lot of folks, especially those on Medicaid and Medicare.
And what happened exactly this session? Not detailed committee by committee, but did it pass the House? Did it, assuming, die in the Senate, or what was the exact outcome?
Okay, so again, like most bills that were pretty aggressively progressive, the bill sailed through the House. And what was interesting, in tandem with the beginning of life abortion, the extreme abortion bill, the suicide bill got held up in the House because they couldn't get the votes. And so, kind of to set up the narrative, what happened is that the abortion up to birth bill also swept through the House committees sailed through the House floor. There were 6 Democrats that voted against that bill, but the backlash from that vote that many Democrats took, there was a tremendous amount of backlash from the public and from their constituency that we believe and we're hearing made them reticent to vote for the suicide bill.
You mean the abortion bill?
No. So what happened is the abortion bill passed the House first, early in the session that passed through the House, and then went on to the Senate. The assisted suicide bill kind of followed, and they never introduced it onto the House floor because they didn't have the votes after, kind of in the wake of the HB 51 abortion bill.
Okay.
So it was associated. The 2 bills were associated in a sense.
Got it. Okay. Now, I want to talk about a little bit of your organization's grassroots efforts and what you did that you thought was successful, and just kind of how things worked up in the roundhouse. But I do want to talk about the abortion bill. Now, from an outsider, maybe even somebody who's relatively pro-life, but sees Roe v. Wade as impactful and sees the Supreme Court as unlikely to overturn it, what was the significance of HB 51, the abortion bill, that your group was effective in ultimately defeating?
Well, so the HB 51 was sort of a preemptive measure, at least according to the sponsors, that they were preemptively wanting to address New Mexico statute, because prior to Roe v. Wade, the statute that's on the books is pretty restrictive of all abortion. So abortion is considered
So New Mexico statute,
right? So
is on the books,
right? So 1968, it's called the Criminal Abortion Act, I believe, and it's in the criminal section of the state statutes. That would become law if Roe v. Wade gets overturned, and we're not, so their answer, so the progressive sort of abortion up to birth crowd's answer was writing this bill HB 51, which essentially just strikes out the entirety of that statute instead of coming in. And so what we did is we offered an alternative to that. We also believe in decriminalizing abortion, but we put in, some safeguards. And so they just wanted to strike the whole statute from the books, leave it completely wide open and unregulated, take away parental notification, which is in that statute, and then also take away physician licensing requirements. And the big one, I think, that got people really concerned from across the state was taking away an explicit conscience protection for medical professionals.
Now, but just to emphasize, under current law, as Roe v. Wade is in effect in New Mexico, this legislation, yes or no, HB 51, would not have any real impact until or unless Roe v. Wade were somehow overturned.
No, because here was the Trojan horse of that entire bill. The Trojan horse of the bill would strike the only explicit conscience protection for physicians. And here's the whole caveat to that is that the groups behind HB 51, you had the ACLU of New Mexico. I'm sure you're familiar with them. Yeah. Young Women United, and Respect New Mexico Women. They formed a coalition called Entiende New Mexico. And within that coalition, leading up to the session, they were advocating for the removal of religious refusals for so-called healthcare decisions. And so what they were pushing for was to force, to take away that conscience protection that would allow a doctor or medical professional to refuse to perform an abortion. They wanted to strike that from the books, which is currently enforced. And that was affirmed by the Attorney General, Gary King, I believe, that affirmed that this is a portion of the bill. Even though Roe v. Wade is now sort of the law of the land, New Mexico's never came back and addressed abortion-specific law, save a partial birth abortion ban. But there's a big loophole in the law, except for a few of these portions of that statute that are enforceable, which is the conscience protection. So they wanted to remove the conscience protection in order to remove what they call religious refusals and set up every hospital, clinic, and doctor's office across the state to either perform or refer for abortions.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a big difference because as I'd understood it from reading a lot of the media coverage, and Rio Grande Foundation does not involve itself in the abortion issue, sympathetic in many ways to your cause and your efforts, but it's just not what we do. It had seemed like to us that it was much more provisional based on Roe v. Wade. And my own kind of analytical hat of looking at the Supreme Court and its approach to the issues, it just seemed like it was not likely that there is going to be in a long time a repeal of Roe v. Wade. Now, but the conscious provisions is important. It's an important victory.
Well, and then, it is. It is. And what ended up happening with this HB 51, I mean, I think the word got out. We had doctors and medical professionals from across the state contacting us, showing up for these committee hearings, expressing their very valid concerns about that issue. And the arguments that were offered, from the sponsors and people behind the bill were just not sufficient. And they often claim, well, there's other statutes, there's other federal laws, and there are not. There's not a single overriding federal law that would prevent a doctor or a medical professional from being forced to participate in abortions, save the Medicaid-funded, hospitals.
Right. And, we had a medical doctor on just last week talking about healthcare, and this is one of the problems you face when you have more and more government involvement in healthcare coverage and funding it, is that governor, I believe the quote is, "He who pays the piper calls the tune," and that is a very serious issue, no matter what your view is on a variety of issues in healthcare. So let's kind of move on beyond the background. Those were the two major issues that your organization focused on this session. But what did you do, I guess, for lack of a better word, given the folks in Santa Fe, and what was your strategy to get these bills defeated? Because it is a tough situation in the House. The Senate is a little more reasonable, but what kind of grassroots organizing and media and outreach and whatnot did you guys really do to make this result happen?
Well, excuse me. Well, because of the abortion folks, the abortion lobby being so aggressive and really celebrating the victory in the November election statewide here in New Mexico. They had a friendly governor who was full force behind this, and they had all the pickups in the House. They were pretty excited about introducing this bill, so they announced a pre-file. Even in November, this was being covered, by practically every media outlet was already covering this as a done deal and messaging it as some like an outdated bill, an outdated statute. And so going in, we knew that this was coming our way, so we were able to mobilize and form a coalition early on that included a couple other groups, the Family Policy Alliance of New Mexico and another sort of conservative faith-based group, Right to Life Committee of New Mexico. And we had also meetings with some other organizations, the New Mexico Conference of Catholic Bishops. So we all came together and really put together a game plan early on. And I think with any sort of issue, I would, my sort of passion is the media and following messaging and following the public temperament. I think it's really important to be, if we want to be successful in our endeavors in public policy and advocacy, that you really have to follow follow what the public perception is. And so we sat down and put a plan in place that, we address the messaging behind this issue and how to, you really got to think in a 3-second soundbite how you're going to frame an issue. And I think for any whatever group issue that you're involved in, because the public has such a short attention span. So we sat down, we mapped out the messaging, we mapped out, sort of what our coalition was going to work towards and stay on the same page. I think that's important. And you see this again with messaging, even especially at the national level, you repeat, stay on message, stay unified. And I think that was an important factor for us.
And you obviously succeeded greatly in that. And I want to talk to you about one of your coalition partners in a minute here. But do you find that some of the political issues, as we saw heading into our session, really provided an ability for you to engage with people? The Virginia Governor Northam and his comments about infanticide, for lack of a better word, and then New York passing legislation also basically, as I understand it, providing a very, very liberal approach to abortion. That certainly is the one of the two issues we talked about. Assisted suicide was a secondary issue from the public, the media, and whatnot, but the abortion issue was definitely front and center. Mm-hmm. Did you find that the zeitgeist of the times kind of helped you out, or what was your approach there?
I mean, well, absolutely. I think that's what really opened the doors for us to have a discussion, have an honest discussion about what HB 51, what that legislation entailed. But I think it reached a lot of hearts and minds, not just here in New Mexico, but nationwide. I think the nation was awakened to the outrage and the extremism of progressive Democrat movement, and this type of bill that would have codified abortion up to birth, and explicitly and then implicitly allows for infanticide.
So you had some of these big issues that were public debates in other states and really nationwide that were going on. Science, the left loves to talk about how scientific they are and how they seem to have this stranglehold on science. I mean, climate change is the big one, but they also come after religious folks for various things like homosexuality and other issues that they try to make it sound like anyone who doesn't believe what they believe is not scientific. But a lot of the science really seems to be moving towards the pro-life perspective in terms of babies being born at so early of a stage in
well, the science has never changed.
True.
So the science has always been defining life as beginning at conception, right? Whether or not we want to admit that the science, accept the science for what it is another question. But yeah, I would say in this area, the left is very much anti-science, anti-biology. And when you look at what Roe v. Wade did, back in 1973, which again was decided on, I would add, by all men justices, they didn't have the science and technology of ultrasound, which we do have now, and we have sort of a window into the womb, and we can see that these are human beings. They're babies. They're just smaller than us, and they're in a different stage of development, and like we all are. So we're still developing. I mean, and as far as growing, as far as your body, your cells, the cellular growth continues. Up until about the age of 24, you quit developing. Right? You're fully developed around the age of 24 scientifically. So they're in the beginning stages of their development. And so a lot of the arguments are very, I would say, very intellectually dishonest, for sure, as it regards to science.
And I'm certainly not saying that the science itself has changed, but our scientific understanding, at least in the popular sphere, and the ability for average person to grasp the reality of the situation is changing. And one of the things that I think is also a help is, and I don't know what your involvement is, if any, but the popular culture and even into the theaters with a movie relating to the abortion issue, Unplanned, that's now out. I still believe it's in theaters, but very impressive that this movement, it's in so many ways countercultural to everything else happening in the United States right now, has been able to break through into movies. So talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, they're, coming right out of the session. I think the next following week, which is, I think, 2 or 3 weeks ago now, I can't remember. The movie Unplanned was introduced into, I think 1,000 theaters nationwide. And that's the life story of a former abortion clinic worker, Planned Parenthood clinic director, Abby Johnson. And it tells her sort of experience getting involved within the abortion industry, within Planned Parenthood, how she became the employee of the year for their clinic, and how she really believed that she was helping women until she went and was asked to participate in an actual abortion, and she was able to see the ultrasound of a 13-week baby and his life being taken before her eyes. And I think that's was a really powerful moment in the movie, and I think it's a really powerful notion for people that believe they support what they think is choice and women's rights, to actually see what that means and really peel back a layer of what this issue is really about. And so I think we've seen a lot of really exciting movement in that area. To my knowledge, that there's been at least 100 abortion clinic workers that saw the movie that reported back. Because at the end of the movie, they have like a text number, like you can text if you're, you want healing, you want someone to talk to, or you're thinking about leaving your job. And so they've had 100 people respond that were directly involved in working in abortion clinics that are often, these people are very, they're traumatized because they're, the movie also shows where they're, the quote unquote medical waste, of little tiny little arms and legs and body parts that they're having to reassemble in order to ensure that everything got removed from the uterus.
Wow. So who is involved in supporting that kind of thing? Because these movies weren't being made 20 years ago. Is this just people on Kickstarter getting things done? You don't have the same access, and I'm not talking specifically about your group, but is this a total, whether it's the movie or your organization, are they just totally grassroots type funded organizations? Is there a conservative donor base that's engaged with these kinds of projects?
Well, what I would say to that, Paul, and probably what a lot of other folks would say, is that the church, a lot of this is come about by prayer and people involved, individual involvement within these churches, and I believe that movie production, I think it's called Pure Flicks, which they were the people behind producing that movie. They got the funding, I think, from the founder of My Pillows, or the CEO of My Pillow.
Oh,
yeah, he was a big donor as well.
Interesting. Okay, well, I mean, it shows that one or two major donors in this day and age, you can get a movie made for a relatively low cost. But let's talk about the Catholic Church, because they're an interesting group. I'm Catholic. I think you are as well. As last time we had this conversation, they're a group that we've worked with, the Rio Grande Foundation has, in an effort to try to achieve school choice. They're also a group that, the Archdiocese of Santa Fe in particular, not just the Catholic Church as a whole, but the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, had some very harsh words for one John Arthur Smith a year ago, Senate Finance Committee chairman, when the lobbyist made some remarks about him that I thought were unfounded on his lack of support of pre-K and tapping the permanent fund. That issue also failed this session, by the way, as an aside. The Catholic Church came up big this session. Would you say? Were they a very active partner in this and effective?
Yeah, absolutely. We had a lot of support on the ground in the lobbying efforts. And as you know, it's kind of like that's a full-time job in of itself, is having a regular presence in Santa Fe, in the offices of the lawmakers and speaking with, people of influence in Santa Fe. So that was very helpful. Excuse me. And I believe there is a new individual, Deacon Steve Rangel, who I think he's been tasked to help with our cause more specifically. So he was also very helpful. I know Alan Sanchez was there for many of the committee hearings as well. And they helped actually. So one of the things that we did during the session, we probably had, I believe, 3, if not 4 different major events or rallies, that we advertised. We got people there. We had speakers. We had legislators involved. They also were great champions, some of our pro-life legislators. But we had these major events, and they did, towards the end of the session, the Archdiocese of Santa Fe did help organize a prayer rally on behalf of the unborn and the life issue. And so I think that was really effective because, let's be honest, New Mexico has a pretty strong faith individuals of faith, especially Catholics. Mm-hmm. So I think that was really helpful.
Yeah, these are things that we at the Rio Grande Foundation and folks who organize around issues of economic concern, it's something we look on with some envy because abortion and pro-life issues resonate so inherently with people, whereas pocketbook issues and the ability to keep what is yours is much more of an intellectual thing, doesn't necessarily come directly to the heart. And it would be, it's an issue and an approach that groups like the Institute for Justice have done a very good job of trying to take issues. They got a movie made actually about Suzette Kelo, the eminent domain issue, New London, Connecticut, where her house was being taken from her. And those kinds of isolated, specific issues really resonate with people.
Right. But I think, I would disagree with you because I think like the left, they can take any issue and make it emotional. And I think we just have to get better, or you all have to get better at messaging and figuring out what, again, like I said, the 3-second soundbite, the emotional aspect and how it directly impacts individuals. I think conservatives don't always do the best job at messaging.
I would echo that and amplify it. Yes, absolutely. So moving on beyond the session, and you would judge the session on its merits relatively successful. Considering where you thought it could be.
Yeah, considering what we thought it could be, yes. But we did have our own legislation that we introduced, pro-life legislation that would have addressed the concerns that most New Mexicans have about the issue of abortion. And we actually did some polling that we saw. I think we had 843 respondents with which left for about a plus or minus 3 point margin of error. And thank you. But we saw that every issue that we have been speaking about for the last 5 years, parental notification of abortion, we don't have any sort of legal requirement for that. So a minor, young, 13-year-old girl, your daughter could be taken for an abortion by an adult male, be returned to school the same day, and you would never know or be informed of that. So we tried to include that issue in I guess, a comprehensive bill. It was called the Keisha Adkins Women's Health and Safety Act. Died in its first committee. We also had a limit on abortion after 5 months in there, as well as some reporting requirements and explicit conscience protection. So that bill died in its first committee.
So you brought forth some proactive legislation, and of course died. So That's not a surprise because the same thing happened with kind of economic-oriented issues that we are focused on it. So, and that's just given where we are legislatively in terms of the makeup of the bodies. You're not going to get a lot of pro-life or pro-economic liberty legislation at the same time. So, we've got a 30-day session coming up in 2020. It's not all that close, but the legislature will be just the same, as will the governor. I suspect you're expecting another run at some pro-choice, similar to HB 51.
Well, yeah, they've already, the day after that the bill was defeated, the sponsor, Joanne Ferrari, who's from the Las Cruces, Doña Ana area, she's the main sponsor, along with Debbie Armstrong. I'm sure you're familiar with Representative Armstrong. So they, Ferrari, indicated that the bill would be coming back. The governor did affirm that publicly, so we know it's coming back. And I guess for clarification for your audience, that on the budget session, typically the bills that are introduced have to be considered germane to the budget. And but unless the governor indicates otherwise, and she has
But
indicated,
of course, this is the top priority for the governor.
yeah, absolutely. So she will be bringing the bill back.
So we know the 30-day session will have another discussion of this particular issue. And I know you'll be working very hard to ensure that the same situation, that the results are the same, that the legislation does not pass and make its way to the governor's desk. But of course, the elections of 2020 are the next major kind of political milestone after that session. Now, can you briefly describe for me the history of either your organization or the pro-life movement as a whole in their engagement or lack thereof in New Mexico legislative politics? Because I know you've been active at the Roundhouse. I know the New Mexico pro-life, Right to Life is also active. But ultimately, lobbying and rallies and all that kind of stuff only goes so far. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, it's the people who are elected. And in this legislature, especially in the House, they basically said, we've got the votes, we were elected, and we're going to take those votes and we're going to pass the bills that basically as progressive as we can get through both houses. Mm-hmm. So how do we make this state less of a hard left progressive state? Because by and large, there's a lot of overlap between economic conservatives and pro-life folks. So,
right. And then
what do we do?
Well, I would say, especially, if people that are fiscally conservative, to recognize also that we're being forced to fund abortions here in New Mexico as well through the state Medicaid program. So the Hyde Amendment only covers federally funded abortions, but we do that through our state, and right, to the tune of about $1.3 million in the last reporting period that we obtained information on in 2015, I believe. Okay. So there's your economic aspect, but I think as far as mobilizing, it's tough on our end with this the pro-life issue because we don't have the resources of the other side. And I think that's always been the upper hand that they've had over us, is they know that they have the money. Even the day after the session was out, they immediately took out radio ads against Gabriel Ramos, Senator Ramos in the Silver City area, who kind of led the charge on the Senate floor against HB 51 to defeat the bill on the Senate floor. He was the champion in gathering Democrats. So he's a pro-life Democrat. And there were 8 others that voted against this bill. And so I think there's been a fear among even some of our moderate Republicans that there's going to be, retribution from the abortion lobby, who is probably the 3rd, if not 5th, most powerful money, raising money power brokers in the state.
So have you attempted to engage in voter education in terms of various candidates, or what has that looked like? So I can see the difference between rallies and organizing people during a session, and that can be done at a pretty low cost. Sure. But supporting candidates and helping them get elected it requires real manpower, and it's one of the reasons that the unions in this state play such a big role, is because they have a lot of organization and manpower. Mm-hmm. So is that something that's just been a challenge in the past for the pro-life movement to put together? I
think absolutely. And again, that always goes back to the challenge of money and resources and funding, right? So we have very limited, I'll be honest, we have pretty limited resources and funding to really, make a huge impact on the elections. But I think this time around is going to be different. And I do believe another one of our coalition partners is called the Hispanic Action Network. And that group has successfully managed to mobilize churches and faith-based organizations. And I believe it's something like, I want to say 70% of people that attend church aren't even registered to vote or don't vote. So I think with my issue in particular, the pro-life issue, it's going to be really important for us to touch, and identify some of the key leaders in communities throughout the state that are going to work with us through the churches, through mobilizing, through getting, the connection made between what happens in Santa Fe to what happens in the ballot box.
You think the legislature's approach may contribute to people around the state kind of getting interested and passionate about the issue? Because one of the things that, certainly we're hoping for is that overreach by the legislature will cause a equal and opposite reaction. Now, in New Mexico, to get anything done, it's got to be a very big reaction to move us in a real right direction. But we had what I'm calling the blue tsunami of 2018 in the House. Right. Now all the marbles are on the table. The House is up and the Senate's up. And really,
I think that goes without saying, right? I mean, don't you think we saw a huge backlash even during the session with 29 of our 33 counties becoming, sanctuaries for the Second Amendment. I mean, that was a huge backlash, and the fight is still continuing. To this day, you have an Attorney General, Hector Balderas, that's saying, "Oh, well, the sheriffs must enforce these laws. They have to enforce all the laws." And just last week, he told a progressive, Progress outlet, that he does not believe that he's not going to enforce the abortion laws if Roe v. Wade gets overturned.
Well, the only point I'd question on all of that is that yes, you have sanctuary counties, and Rio Grande Foundation's been involved in defeat of a soda tax in Santa Fe, defeat of mandatory sick leave in Albuquerque, defeat of an APS major tax increase. People often vote certain ways, or their interest is captured for a certain amount of time. And then by the time it actually comes down to voting for the candidates, we've seen it in the legislature time and time again.
I haven't seen it like this before, though. Have you? I've never seen where within really a matter of 2 to 3 weeks, you had 29 counties that took action on their own. Number one, that introduced the Second Amendment sanctuary legislation, number one. But then number two, the media attention and the grassroots, really social media attention that this is grabbing. With my issue as well, I had individuals take on these grassroots, like little mini media campaigns where they were putting up the face of these legislators who voted for abortion up to birth and infanticide. And those posts on social media were going viral. They were getting thousands of shares, thousands of reactions from just putting out that information. So I think our job, you're right, it sometimes dies, the excitement dies. Our job is to keep that engagement through to the election cycle, hopefully. And connect the dots for people. But I do think it's different than previous. I think the overreach was so vast that people are really, truly waking up. I'm hearing it every day.
There's no doubt that New Mexico's legislature, especially the House, which was up in 2018, and we saw the blue tsunami, that is a much more progressive group than has ever been involved in New Mexico. And it's one of the subtexts, and we talk about it here on the podcast, but in general, New Mexico's been a Democrat state, but it's traditional Democrats, and that might not always work out well for my economic issues, but on social issues, guns being a preeminent one, abortion being another one, there's a big difference between a progressive and a traditional New Mexico Democrat. And we're certainly hopeful that folks pay attention again in the 30-day session to come in 2020, and then most importantly, pay attention in the elections of 2020, because I'm not sure how New Mexico survives with a total progressive top to bottom
I don't either.
Structure.
It's like we're already at the bottom, and the policies that got us here were already, sort of leftist policies economically that got us at the bottom. And I would argue, I think a lot of people would argue, what came first, the chicken or the egg, but a lot of these poor economic policies is what's led to the crime. There's a correlation with the crime, with the theft, with the education. And so, hopefully, that's going to be the job of a lot of the conservative groups out there to message that and to educate the public. And then let's start plugging people into a mobilization grassroots effort when it comes election time.
Now, I absolutely agree. That was very well said. Now, you're a unique guest because you're coming at this from a socially conservative, abortion-oriented issue that's a little different from what the Rio Grande Foundation typically involves itself in. But another group that you mentioned is the gun rights lobby. Mm-hmm. Now, I haven't seen, and maybe you have in your dealings with the legislature, seen an organized central focal point in terms of organizing the gun rights groups. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen an NRA head or person as the point for the NRA here in New Mexico, mm-hmm. or Gun Owners of America, any of the big national groups, or even local groups. It's been with the sheriffs and whatnot, it's been much more very grassroots.
It is to an extent, but I think there is another local group that's, I don't think they're directly affiliated with the NRA. It's called the New Mexico Shooting Sports Association, I believe.
Okay.
And so they've kind of been driving at least the message. And, but yeah, I think it's what you're trying to say is like, as far as a formally organized,
right.
Yeah. I don't think so either, but I think it's time for some of the leaders, on the conservative side, on the, whatever if they're Democrat or Republican, to start coming together, let's start working together, especially on the issues. Let's start working together. I think there's ways that, like you said earlier, there's overlap, and I can guarantee you that the other side does. I can absolutely guarantee. I mean, in fact, you had the immigration rights groups were, from my understanding, were lobbying for the abortion up to birth bill as well, and back mm-hmm. and forth. And so you had this crossover, and it's there. The other side is very well organized, and they overlap their mobilization efforts for,
Right. And, with regard to the gun groups and, various organizations, now I love what you do. I love your bootstrap activism, but the fact that you're there is probably the most important thing. Life goes to those who show up. And part of New Mexico's challenge, and this is one of those ironic things where it's a economic development and a political problem, is that organizations national in scope often overlook New Mexico. So they don't have a field director in New Mexico. They've got somebody up in Colorado or over in Arizona, and then they have to fly them back and forth. And it really, they're never seen as inside the roundhouse kind of voice who mm-hmm. represents New Mexicans. And, you and I, we live here, we see the things that happen. We're up in the roundhouse. And I just hope that any organization that has any concern about the state of New Mexico has to be involved, and it has to be right now, right. And getting.
Because I would say,
motivated.
I think what we both believe, and I've heard this from a lot of folks, is that, again, we're reaching the point of no return. We're getting to that place. And at the very least, we need to win back the House or the Senate, one of the bodies, because the ramrodding of more dangerous and harmful legislation is going to continue. And at least we'll be able to stop it. And then looking forward to 2020, we need a different governor. We need a different type of leadership in the governor's office in order to undo all the damage. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's going to be really important for people not just to be aware, but you got to look at ways to get involved, to be a part of these get out the vote efforts, and to support local leaders that are going to really support your values and not the values of progressives in Washington. And let's be honest, it is a money game. That's why they had the sweeping victories that they did, is because they have, really, I mean, I think conservatives get labeled as sort of being about the rich being richer, and we have all this money, but really it's the other side that has just a mountain of money. And so I think we need to overcome that with the grassroots, with people plugging in and being aware of what's going on, hopefully.
No doubt about it. And I look forward to working with you on that in the future. Elisa, real quickly, how do people find out more about your group?
Okay, so we have social. So on Facebook, it's NM Alliance for Life. We have a website, nmallianceforlife.org, and on Twitter, I think it's NM4Life.
All right, great. And thank you very much for coming on Tipping Point, New Mexico today. Thanks for tuning in as well to this week's discussion. We're working every day to turn New Mexico around. Go to riograndefoundation.org for more information or to support our work.